I wasn't supposed to sign so fast. Everyone in that room expected the Omega to cry, to beg, to fight for a marriage that had trapped him for years. Instead, the moment the Alpha CEO slid the papers across the desk, he grabbed the pen and signed his own name like his life depended on it. Because it did, he knew exactly how this story ended for someone like him. And he wasn't waiting for fate to catch up. The CEO's expression turned dark. Unreadable. Dangerous. You're really doing this. So why did an Omega, with everything to lose, look more relieved than broken? And what happens when the man he just left refuses to let him go? Grab something warm to drink. Because today's story follows a man who married a CEO he was terrified of, only to become the one thing that terrified the CEO right back. If you've ever wondered what it would feel like to walk away from someone powerful without looking back once, tell us in the comments below. A car crash dropped me straight into the life of some rich nobody who happened to be married to the coldest, most terrifying CEO in the business pages. I remembered exactly how this poor guy's story ended, so before anyone could stop me, I grabbed a pen and signed the divorce papers myself. The CEO's jaw went tight. Julian, are you absolutely sure about this? My heart nearly stopped, not from guilt, from math. I clutched the folder to my chest like it might grow legs and run, sure as I've ever been about anything. And don't even think about clawing back a cent of that settlement. Asher, it's mine now. I spent 3 days flat on my back in a hospital bed before I finally accepted what had happened to me. My name is Julian Cole, or it used to belong to somebody else. A college kid with a mediocre GPA and a weakness for trashy romance novels. And now it belonged to me, wearing the body of a man I actually recognized. Because I'd read this story. Bound to the CEO. 46 Unbearable Chapters of a Poor, brilliant young man named Asher Sue clawing his way up from nothing while his spoiled, obsessive husband made his life hell. And I, through no fault of my own, had woken up inside the husband. The villain. The disposable second lead, whose entire narrative function was to suffer beautifully and then disappear, so the real love story could happen. I knew this role's whole miserable arc without needing to be told. At orientation week. Freshman year. This body's original occupant took one look at Asher Sue across a crowded auditorium and fell hopelessly, humiliatingly in love. Asher was gorgeous and quietly brilliant. The kind of beautiful that made people forget what they were saying, mid-sentence and dirt poor. His father couldn't hear or speak, and his mother's kidneys were failing by the week. Julian the original. Julian spent 4 years chasing him with money, gifts, and a very rich family's shameless leverage. Until Asher, drowning in his mother's medical bills, finally gave in and married him just to keep her alive. 5 years later, Asher had gone from a broke undergrad to one of the sharpest young CEOs in the country. Julian had gone nowhere at all richer, engrais, more possessive, more insufferable by the year until, in a jealous rage, he shoved Asher's college sweetheart, Marcus Lee, down a flight of stairs and broke the man's leg. That was the final straw. Asher filed for divorce right around the time this body got hit by a car. He didn't bother visiting the hospital until day 3. When he finally showed up, he threw the papers onto my blanket without so much as a hello. Julian, haven't you humiliated yourself enough? His voice could have frosted glass. And I hated myself a little for this. My pulse still stuttered looking at him. No wonder whoever used to live in this body had wasted 5 years of his life on this face. It was genuinely unfair how good looking the man was. Then my eyes dropped to the settlement figure printed at the bottom of the page, and every other thought in my head evaporated. Holy hell. I'm about to be rich. The Cole family had money. Surrey. But this body's previous owner was the family disappointment, a spoiled, useless older son next to a golden boy younger brother who was better at literally everything. There had never been any real inheritance waiting for him. Meanwhile, Asher's company was now worth more than the entire Cole conglomerate. And once this marriage officially ended, half of everything he'd built over the last 5 years would become mine. I'd clearly lived a good life in whatever came before this one, because getting handed a payday like this felt like cosmic justice. I kept my head down and my expression carefully blank, terrified that if I let myself grin, Asher would notice something was off about his husband. Then I took a slow breath and said, as flatly as I could manage, fine. I agreed to the divorce. He blinked. Clearly, he hadn't expected me to fold that easily, but opportunities like this didn't wait around for anyone to change their mind. Before he could say another word, I'd already scrawled my name across the line. His brows knit together, like he was trying to find the trick. I turned my face to the window and said, in my best imitation of a man with nothing left to feel, I've thought it over. Asher, Let's just let each other go. Silence behind me, longer than I expected. I was already halfway through calculating how many zeros I'd be looking at when I realized he still hadn't moved. I was staring at the signed papers like they'd personally betrayed him. Something else? I asked, mildly annoyed. You're free to go. You know. His face went hard and unreadable. I decided to be generous. By the way, how's Marcus's leg holding up? Shouldn't you be at his bedside instead of mine? Asher's expression turned to ice. I felt a flicker of unease. Had I misjudged this? Was he regretting handing over that much money already? But the ink was dry. My signature was on file. And there wasn't a court in the country that would let him walk it back now. Honestly, considering how graciously I was letting him go, he should have been thanking me. Marcus Lee had been Asher's first love back in college, gentle, steady, the kind of quietly devoted that made spoiled rich boys like the original Julian look even worse by comparison. Marcus came from a broken home and no money at all. But he'd clawed his way to the top of every class he was in. He and Asher understood each other in a way nobody else ever managed to. If it hadn't been for the original Julian's money and his family's pressure, the two of them would have built a whole life together after graduation. Instead, jealousy ate that old version of Julian alive. He picked fights with Marcus at every opportunity, needled him in public, and eventually resorted to outright violence. Asher had never forgiven him for it. And honestly, neither would I. It didn't take a genius to guess what fate awaited a background character who'd crossed both leads of the story this badly. The smart move, the only move, was to take the money and disappear before the plot found a way to punish me for his sins. Asher stormed out and slammed the door hard enough to rattle the blinds. I pressed a hand to my chest. Still has that temper, I muttered, not even mad about it, because I was already thinking about all the money that was about to land in my account. This kind of windfall doesn't happen to just anybody. My phone buzzed. A text from Dexter Chen Dex, the original Julian's childhood best friend. A rich kid who lived for parties and had approximately zero interest in ever holding a real job. Heard your husband finally bothered to show his face today. Dripping with sarcasm. Dex and Asher had never gotten along. Dex thought Asher was a cold, calculating climber. Asher thought Dex was a useless trust fund brat who'd never worked a day in his life. The two families crossed paths constantly since the marriage, which only made things worse. Dex's own father kept holding Asher up as an example, which Dex hated with his entire soul. This time, Dex was clearly here to laugh at my misery. Did I care? Not remotely. I was too busy getting rich. Yep, I typed back, snapping a photo of the signed papers and sending it along. Officially single as of 10 minutes ago. Dinner's on you tonight. He called immediately. Are you out of your mind? Rude. I told him I'd be discharged soon and heading straight to the county clerk's office to file. Turned out the crash had only left me with a mild concussion. Small miracles. You planning a celebration or what? I asked. Dex went quiet for a second, then laughed. Fine. What kind of celebration are you looking for? I heard you opened a new bar. A week later, I walked out of the hospital in a suit that cost more than most people's rent. Looking, if I do say so myself, like a man who just won the lottery. Dex crossed his arms and snorted. Dressed up like that, just to check out of a hospital. You've completely lost it. I clicked my tongue. You have no idea what a big day this is. Dex gave up arguing and turned to leave and nearly walked straight into Asher. Their eyes met. Cold on cold. You're here, I said, walking up with a grin. Where's the car? Asher's expression softened. Just slightly. Parking lot. Let's go. Dex, irritated, shot me a look. You're not riding with me. I waved him off. Gotta finalize the paperwork with Asher. Easier to just take his car. I turned to Asher, who'd frozen mid-step. What are you standing there for? Let's go. Dex burst out laughing. Of course. Can't keep something this urgent waiting. Asher's mouth curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. In an awful hurry to be rid of me. Aren't you? Weren't you the one who filed in the first place? I've got plans tonight, I said honestly. Just trying to get this wrapped up fast so I'm not wasting your time. Asher was always busy. Always somewhere else. He barely came home even when we were still technically married. And I knew exactly why. I had zero interest in dragging that out either. His face went colder, and he turned without another word. The clerk's office wasn't crowded, so we were called up fast. Right as we stepped toward the counter, his phone rang. I caught the name on the screen out of the corner of my eye. Marcus. He stepped aside to take it, and I could hear the change in his voice, soft, warm, careful in a way it never once was with me. Yeah, I'm still out handling something. 5 years of marriage, and I'd never once heard that tone directed at me. This whole arrangement had been built on obligation from day one, and no amount of forced dinners was ever going to change that. A clerk called out, impatient, "Are you two filing or not?" I felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for the man who used to own this body. In Asher's heart, he'd never had a place at all. "Asher," I said, "can we handle this first?" He blinked, startled that I'd asked instead of demanded, then said into the phone, "Have the doctor check you first. I'll be there soon." 20 minutes later, I walked out holding a freshly stamped divorce certificate, doing everything in my power not to cry actual tears of joy. It's mine. All of it is finally mine. Starting today, I was going to travel, drink good wine, and enjoy every second of a life I hadn't earned, but fully intended to enjoy anyway. I turned to Asher, radiating as much sincerity as I could fake. Thanks for everything, and goodbye forever. This time, Dex was waiting outside, leaning against a Ferrari the color of a fire alarm. Impossible to miss. I jogged over, grinning. "Your boy's rich now. Somebody's buying drinks." Behind me, Asher's voice, hesitant. "Julian." I turned. Something else. His mouth pressed into a thin line, unreadable. If this had still been the man he married, he'd have spent the next hour trying to decode every flicker of Asher's expression. I couldn't be bothered to keep up the performance. "No, then I'm gone." I picked up my pace, staying far. Far away from both leads of this story was the entire key to my survival plan. As Dex pulled out of the lot, I caught one glimpse of Asher in the side mirror, standing alone in the crowd, looking smaller than I expected. Well, now he's finally free of me too. Dex glanced sideways. "Feeling regret?" I grinned. "Tell me you saved a few cute bartenders for me tonight." Dex was speechless for a solid 5 seconds. "I've been worrying about you for nothing. I actually thought you were still in love with him. And you're practically glowing right now. Is it that obvious?" I flipped down the visor mirror to check. Julian Cole, 28 years old, aged up a decade in the blink of an eye. But thankfully, this face had aged well. And more importantly, this face now had money attached to it. And doesn't love me. So I'm done loving him too. At a red light, Dex studied me for an uncomfortably long moment. "That crash really did change you." My heart skipped. I shrugged it off. Near-death experiences have a way of clarifying priorities. He blinked, then smiled. "Fair enough. Drinks are on me tonight." 2 hours later, he was regretting that offer. His face had gone thunderous. And it wasn't about the bar tab, it was about the boys circling our table. I raised my glass toward him. "Come on, have a drink with me." I gestured at the group around us. "Look at them. Sweet, gorgeous, and every single one of them a better time than my ex ever was. Honestly, with this much money and this face, why did the guy who used to live in this body ever waste 5 years hanging himself on one branch?" Dex smirked. Finally seeing the light, one of the boys leaned in with a bottle, smiling. "Try this one." Handsome. I reached for it, but Dex snatched it out of my hand first. "No mixing drinks. You just got out of the hospital. And I'm not calling an ambulance for you tonight." The boy went pale and apologized. I waved it off, generous in my post-divorce euphoria. Then shot Dex a look. "Double standard much. You let every guy you're seeing pour you drinks. But the second it's my turn, suddenly there are rules. That's completely different." Dex shot back. "How is it different? I'm a newly minted rich man. I get to do whatever I want." I stretched, satisfied, and let my head fall back against the booth. Somewhere behind us, a low bass line thumped through the floor, and the string lights strung along the bar caught the ice in Dex's glass and threw little gold coins of light across the table. For a second, just a second, known of it felt like something I'd stolen. It felt like something I'd earned, which was a stupid thing to think about, a life I'd been living for exactly 1 week. Then, out of nowhere, "Does your family know about the divorce yet?" I froze. I'd genuinely forgotten that part existed. Dex read my silence perfectly. "You're scared to tell them. Not scared strategic." Julian's parents had never gotten along with him. They'd made no secret of favoring his younger brother. And marrying Asher against their wishes had caused a family rupture that never fully healed. Once Asher's star started rising, they'd flipped completely and blamed Julian for every friction in the marriage. Even the villain's own family had never really been in his corner. But whatever the papers were filed, what did I have left to be afraid of? The following days were even better than I'd imagined. I had the household staff pack up every trace of Asher and ship it off. The villa had been a wedding gift from the Cole family. But Asher had never liked staying there. Every corner probably reminded him of some humiliation he'd been put through. He'd mostly lived at the office anyway. And once his company took off, he'd bought his own apartment near work. The one time, the old Julian dropped by unannounced. He'd walked in on Marcus there, just sheltering from the rain. Supposedly. That fight lasted a month. In the end, he'd folded, apologized, groveled because to him, Asher was his entire world. Poor guy. It was strange, cataloging someone else's heartbreak like a museum exhibit and still feeling the faint, secondhand ache of it somewhere behind my ribs. I didn't examine that too closely at the time. Meanwhile, I had an entire 3-story villa to myself. It felt a little too empty after the staff finished clearing Asher's things out. So I did the reasonable thing. I went shopping. This one, that one, not that one. Wrap up the rest. The store manager's face lit up like Christmas morning. So did mine, trailing a small parade of shopping bags. I was nearly out the door when I ran straight into Asher and, standing just behind him, Marcus. His leg seemed to be healing well enough that he was out shopping already. Asher's mouth moved before I could walk past. It's his mother's birthday soon. I'm helping him find a gift. I blinked. Why are you telling me this? Not my business anymore. Out of courtesy, I nodded and tried to keep moving. But Marcus spoke up, wearing an expression I could only describe as strategically apologetic. Mr. Cole, I'm sorry about my leg. I had to ask Asher to help me get around today. Looks like you've bought quite a bit. Need a hand carrying it. What a masterful little performance. In one breath, he'd reminded everyone in earshot who'd shoved him down a flight of stairs. Implied, I had no business being jealous of anything, and generously offered up my ex-husband's help like it cost him nothing. No need, I said. My car's downstairs. Wouldn't want to trouble Asher with something so trivial anyway. Marcus blinked. Thrown. I turned to Asher, feigning surprise. You didn't tell him we're already divorced. Silence. Marcus's head whipped toward Asher. Stunned. Asher's jaw tightened. I don't like broadcasting my personal life. Was that a jab at me for throwing a small, tasteful celebration with my closest friend? Petty. Marcus recovered his voice. Asher, you too. Why didn't you say anything? I've been busy, Asher said quietly. Funny that was the exact line he used to brush off his husband for 5 straight years. And now it was Marcus catching the edge of it. Though for Marcus, busy from Asher was clearly still a win compared to what I got. Well, you two carry on, I said, hefting my bags. I've got somewhere to be. Wait, Asher's voice again, oddly hesitant. My mother mentioned you haven't visited in a while. If you have time, you should go see her. I considered it and agreed. After all, the woman hadn't done anything to deserve losing me as a son-in-law. Asher visibly relaxed. I'll come pick you up in the morning. I smiled and jangled my keys. No need. I've still got a car and 2 working legs. I'll drive myself. Both of their expressions froze slightly at that. Apparently the new, self-sufficient version of me was taking some getting used to. The next morning, I drove out to the care facility myself, an expensive, high-end place tucked in the suburbs. All excellent amenities and an even more excellent price tag. Mr. Cole, you're here. The caregiver on duty, knowing the state of things between me and Asher, greeted me with a very thin layer of politeness over open coldness. Asher's mother lay in bed, thin and pale from years of dialysis, though clearly improved since moving here. Her eyes lingered on the food container in my hands, and even the caregiver's mouth curled with something like disdain. She knew perfectly well that whatever I did, Asher would only find fault with it. Julian, Mrs. Sue said warmly when she spotted me, struggling to sit a little straighter against her pillows. You've been so busy lately. It's been a while, hasn't it? I felt a genuine pang of guilt. Whoever this body used to belong to had used this woman shamelessly to keep leverage over her son, and she'd never once done anything but care for him sincerely. I've been a bit tied up, I said. Brought you some soup. She caught my hand, studying my face. Has Asher upset you again? I shook my head, but she wasn't buying it. That boy keeps everything locked up inside. If he's given you trouble, tell me and I'll speak to him. The room smelled faintly of eucalyptus balm and clean linen, the kind of careful, sterile comfort that expensive places were good at manufacturing. On the nightstand sat a small frame photo Asher, maybe 19, arms slung around his mother's shoulders outside a much shabbier apartment than this facility. I found myself staring at it longer than I meant to, trying to reconcile that easy, unguarded smile with the man who'd looked at me like a stranger in a hospital corridor 2 days ago. I stayed for lunch, and as I was getting ready to leave, I finally admitted I might not be able to visit as often for a while. I figured I'd space the visits out slowly and find the right moment to break the news. There was no version of this where the truth stayed hidden forever. And Asher certainly wasn't going to let me keep pretending. Mrs. Sue patted my hand and sighed. You're a good man, Julian. Whatever happened before, it wasn't Asher's fault. Not really. He's never said it out loud. But I know he still carries guilt over it. He loved you. You know, losing the baby broke something in him. My heart stopped cold. The baby. The thing that had ended this marriage before I ever showed up in it. Here's what actually happened. As far as the story I remembered went, 2 years into the marriage, the original Julian pushed hard for a child not out of love, but as leverage. One more chain to keep Asher from ever leaving. Asher, still guilty about how little he genuinely felt for his husband, agreed to a surrogacy arrangement more out of obligation than desire. For a few months, it was genuinely the best stretch of their entire marriage. Julian doted on him, tracked every update from the surrogate, filled the nursery himself. He believed, for the first time, that he was finally winning. But possession makes people insufferable. He hovered, insisted Asher cut back on travel for the baby's sake, used every excuse to keep him close. When Asher tried to join a business trip with Marcus among the delegation, Julian flatly forbade it. And the fight that followed was the worst one they'd ever had. Then you just act like a normal person for once. Not everyone is as twisted as you are. Asher slammed the door on his way out. That same night, the surrogacy arrangement collapsed. The surrogate backed out under mysterious circumstances no one ever fully explained to Julian. I was told it simply fell through. Whatever trust remained between them didn't survive it. From there, it was a straight line to Julian shoving Marcus down a flight of stairs and Asher walking out for good. What made it worse, thinking it over now, was that none of it had needed to happen the way it did. Asher never actually wanted a family with a man he didn't love, but he'd been so deep in guilt and obligation by that point that saying no to anything Julian asked for felt like more trouble than it was worth. And Julian, for his part, was smart enough to know exactly what he was doing. He didn't ask for a child because he wanted to be a father. He asked because a baby was the only kind of rope he had left to keep someone from walking away. And some small, honest part of him had always known that, made him no better than the man his own parents had accused him of being. It's all in the past. I told Mrs. so quietly, that version of me is gone. It ended with him. I left the nursing home in a strange, heavy mood. I couldn't fully name whether it belonged to me or to whatever was left of the man who used to live in this body. I honestly couldn't say. The feeling only got worse when I realized, halfway to the parking lot, that I'd lost my car keys somewhere inside. I called Dex. Come get me. Am I your chauffeur now? I'll pay you. The facility sat in the middle of nowhere. Cabs were non-existent. And by the time Dex finally caved and drove me home, it was already dark and pouring rain. Since sending him back out in that mess felt cruel even by my standards, I let him crash in the second-floor guest room. The doorbell rang at an ungodly hour the next morning. Half asleep, I stumbled down to answer it. Why are you here? Asher stood on the doorstep, mouth already open to say something, when footsteps came down the stairs behind me and Dex's voice, groggy and irritated, called out, Who is it? Asher's whole face went to ice in half a second. Looks like I'm interrupting. Oh, now you realize you're interrupting. I said, and why the attitude? This is my house. You're the ex here. I don't think you've got much standing to play the wrong party. I turned back to Dex. No big deal. Go back to sleep. Dex, now fully and gleefully awake, leaned on the railing. We've got a guest. Rude not to invite him in. Julian. I ignored him and turned back to Asher, who I had exactly zero intention of letting past the doorway. I'd only just finished having every trace of him removed from this house. Was there something you needed? Mr. Sue. Asher's jaw tightened, clearly irritated by Dex's presence, but unable to say a word about it. He wasn't even remotely on Dex's level in this house anymore. And both of them knew it. He pulled a key from his pocket and held it out. Left this at my mother's. She asked me to return it. Translation. My mother made me come here. Thanks, I said, taking it. Didn't need to trouble yourself. I've got a spare. Silence. I let it stretch a beat too long. Anything else? No. He turned and left without another word. I shut the door. Dex was watching me from the stairs. Arms crossed. What? Nothing. Just seems a little heartless. The way you talk to your ex. If you've got nothing to say, don't say it. Don't tell me you haven't noticed how he looks at you. Dex said, tilting his head. He didn't rush over here at 7 in the morning for a house key. Julian. And am I supposed to chase him because he finally noticed I exist? I found the whole idea funny. If anything, I should have filed sooner. Would have saved myself years. Dex went quiet, then laughed. Well, look at you. Finally growing a spine. I woke up starving that afternoon to a phone full of missed calls. All from Julian's parents. They'd found out about the divorce. And the messages were a symphony of fury. You divorced Asher. Do you have any idea what you've done? We were in the middle of a partnership negotiation with his company. How selfish can one person be? I don't have a son like you. I skimmed it all. Then went to find food. Dex, I discovered, had ordered an entire feast and was calmly eating it without me. No conscience. Eating all that alone. Should I starve waiting for you? Solid logic. I sat down and went straight for my favorite dish. Dex genuinely knew how to order good takeout. Your parents called me too, by the way. He said between bites. Said you weren't picking up. Yeah, I know. Right on cue. The phone rang again. I answered. A sharp voice launched in before I could say hello. Julian, you go find Asher right this instant and tell him you made a mistake. Beg him to remarry you. Remarry. I held the phone away from my ear for a second, genuinely stunned. Getting yelled at was infinitely preferable to Asher's actual wrath. But this was a new level of unreasonable. Julian, are you even listening to me? I'm listening. It's not happening. Is this how you speak to your parents? Didn't you tell me I wasn't your son anymore? Or did you forget that part? Dead silence on the other end. I hung up and blocked the number. Dex, having watched the entire exchange with his mouth slightly open, finally spoke. Not only did you dump your husband, now you're standing up to your parents too. Who even are you? Where there's oppression, I said around a mouthful of food, there's resistance. He smirked, resting his chin on his hand. So am I next. I gave him a thumbs up for self-awareness. Speaking of help me find a new place. I don't like being this easy for people to drop by uninvited. Dex, for all his uselessness at literally everything else, was genuinely excellent at getting things done fast when it mattered. By the next day, he'd found me a newly renovated villa across town. Previous owner moved abroad, desperate to sell. I signed the paperwork within the hour and had a moving crew emptying the old house before the ink dried. Mr. Cole, what's in this box? It's heavy. One of the movers was hauling a sealed cardboard box down from the third floor. Before I could go check, my phone rang. Hello. Is this Mr. Cole? This is Third People's Hospital. Your husband collapsed on the street. Could you come in? Please. Turned out Asher's phone still had my number saved under emergency contact husband. A leftover from back when he was pregnant with the surrogate and wanted someone reachable at all times. Neither of us had gotten around to changing it. Small. Stupid detail. It shouldn't have bothered me as much as it did. I'm not his husband anymore. I said, already reaching for my keys anyway. But is he all right? Low blood sugar. Probably. Nothing life-threatening. But his condition overall wasn't great. It's better if you... I'm a little tied up, I said. Try his current boyfriend. Marcus Lee. Should be in his contacts. He can handle it. I hung up, glanced around the living room, now a maze of half-packed boxes, and decided the rest could wait. I spent the afternoon playing video games and trying out a new barbecue place across town. Good enough that I couldn't resist posting a few photos. Another day of living my best life. I captioned it. Dex, who almost never commented on anything online, chimed in with approval. Marcus, unexpectedly, also left a comment polite on the surface, dripping with judgment underneath. Julian, I know you two are divorced, but Asher's in the hospital right now. Don't you think you should visit? What is wrong with this guy? Barely anyone knew about the divorce yet, and I hadn't figured out how to announce it, and now he'd put himself directly on the moral high ground in front of my entire feed. Fine. Two could play that game. A good ex knows how to act dead, I replied. All faux sincerity. Didn't want to cause a scene. But if it means that much to you, I'll go visit. We were classmates. After all, the comments exploded. Marcus quietly deleted his, oh, so deleting it makes it disappear. I followed up with another post. Question for the group, best gift to bring your ex and his new boyfriend at the hospital. Genuinely need advice. This is important. An hour later, I walked into the hospital carrying a bag of fruit and heard Marcus's voice through the door, thick with concern. Asher, don't be upset. I know I overstepped, but I was only thinking of you. No response. You collapsed. And the hospital even called him. And he didn't bother coming. What if something had actually happened to you today? He made it sound like I'd committed a felony. Then, finally, Asher's voice. Tired. I'm a little tired. Marcus, I'd like to be alone for a while. A chair scraped. Marcus appeared in the doorway, froze when he saw me, and Asher followed his gaze pale, stripped of the sharp CO presence I'd only ever seen him wear, an IV taped to the back of his hand. He looked, for the first time since I'd met him, genuinely fragile. His eyes brightened for half a second, a flicker of tension and something else underneath it. Julianne, what are you doing here? I walked past Marcus into the room. Didn't want people saying I couldn't be bothered to check on my own ex-husband right after the divorce. We're still classmates. At the end of the day, no need to make it weird. Asher's face went pale, lips pressing into a line. He must have seen the exchange on my feed. Knowing how proud he was, being publicly needled like that probably felt like a fresh humiliation. His hatred for me had likely just climbed another notch. And honestly, that annoyed me more than it should have. Well, I said, now that I've shown my face, if there's nothing else, I'll head out. His mouth twitched. You really have to be like this. Like what? You didn't visit for 3 full days after your own accident. I think showing up within the hour is generous by comparison. If we're keeping score on who's more heartless, I'm not sure I'm the one losing. His face went ashen. He opened his mouth, but my phone rang. First, the housekeeper. Mr. Cole, most of your things are unpacked, but there's a box we haven't opened. Ceramic pieces. What would you like done with them? I paused. Ceramic. Looks handmade. Wanted to check before we tossed anything. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught Asher's expression shift. Startled, and a memory surfaced that wasn't quite mine. Those pieces had come from a pottery studio Asher worked at part-time in college. The original, Julian used to show up every week. No talent whatsoever. No patience either. Spending entire afternoons there with clay under his nails just to be near him. Every visit he'd leave with some hideously misshapen mug or bowl, and he never once seemed embarrassed about it. Eventually Asher, unable to shake his most loyal and most exhausting customer, gave in and started teaching him directly. They're not important, I said flatly. Toss them. Wait. Asher's voice again, sharper this time. You moved. I had to admit, the man was quick. Yep. Where? Why so sudden? I laughed. How many times do we need to have this conversation? Asher, we're divorced. What I do and where I live isn't your business anymore. Something in his expression faltered, like he'd just heard something he genuinely couldn't process. His eyes reddened, just slightly. After a long moment, he said, Lo, if you don't want the ceramics, I'll send someone to collect them. They're mine. I'll keep them or throw them out, my call. For some reason, that landed harder than I expected. The last bit of light behind his eyes seemed to go out, like watching a candle finally lose to the wind. Marcus stepped forward, clearly alarmed. Asher, are you okay? Asher turned his face away, quietly avoiding Marcus's outstretched hand, and didn't say a word. I had zero interest in whatever was happening between them, so I turned to leave and nearly collided with a woman in scrubs stepping out of the corridor. Her badge read Director, Fertility and Surrogacy Services. You're here again, she asked, studying me with mild concern. Everything all right? I froze. The only thing connecting the original Julian to this department was the surrogacy, the one that had supposedly fallen through on its own. Just visiting a friend, I said carefully. She relaxed. Good. You know, you and your husband are both still young. If you try again someday, I hope you won't feel you have to give it up like last time. I went absolutely still. That single sentence was carrying an enormous amount of information I hadn't asked for. Give it up. Not lost. Not fell through. Given up. Movement behind me, Marcus's voice, sharp with alarm. What are you doing? I turned to see Asher yanking his phone out and physically stepping between me and the doctor. Voice tight. This is a private matter between my husband and me. It doesn't concern you. The words slipped out of him like habit hadn't caught up with the paperwork yet. Weeks divorced, and he still reached for it without thinking. Under different circumstances, I might have found that funny. A chill ran straight down my spine. For the first time, this beautiful, familiar face looked like a total stranger. Asher, I said slowly. What is she talking about? The doctor's brow furrowed. You didn't know. Your husband told our office you two decided your careers came first and weren't ready for a child. So he ended the surrogacy arrangement himself. You're saying you had no idea. I honestly don't remember the drive home. I sat in the study for a long time with my eyes shut. That single piece of information looping over and over. He'd ended it himself. Not a complication. Not the surrogate backing out. A decision. Made it without me. And then buried under a story about a fight and a miscarriage that never technically happened because there had never been a real pregnancy to miscarry. Just a signed contract and a due date that got quietly erased. Something deep in my chest ached like it belonged to someone else, someone who genuinely believed he'd lost a child. And instead had just lost the last thread holding the marriage together. On purpose. Without ever being told. The study had been recently reorganized. I dug through a few boxes until I found one from Julian's college years. And at the bottom, a photo album. If the surrogacy story wasn't what I'd been told, what else about this whole narrative had I gotten wrong? The first page, a photo from military training. Sunblasted and grainy. A boy in fatigues, grinning too wide for the camera. Behind him, on a stage, a slim figure, unmistakably Asher, even from a distance. Underneath, in cramped handwriting, first day of training. A boy collapsed near me. I carried him to the infirmary. Didn't expect to see him again giving the freshman welcome speech. His name is Asher. Pretending to take selfies just to sneak a picture of him? Classic move. That had to be the beginning of it. I laughed a little, despite myself, falling in love in the most cliched way possible. I touched my own face without thinking. The Julian in that novel was selfish, obsessive, cruel nothing like the bright, unguarded kid grinning in this photo. It was hard to believe he'd become the man everyone hated. I kept turning pages. Every single photo was Asher in a lecture hall, on the badminton court with his hair flying loose, eating alone in the cafeteria, working at the pottery shop. Little notes scrawled beside each one. He always eats alone. Always the cheapest thing on the menu. Does he ever get full? He's too busy to even talk to me most days. 4 years of quiet, one-sided devotion. Documented in a handwriting that got smaller and more careful, the deeper I read. He likes someone. Not me. Should I just give up? Graduation's tomorrow. Maybe I should confess and let it go. Then, a few pages later, he disappeared in the middle of the graduation photo shoot. Followed him without meaning to his mother's condition got worse. What is he going to do? The page where the graduation photo should have gone was blank. He'd missed his own graduation, chasing after a boy who didn't love him back. My hands were shaking by the time I found the marriage certificate photo, not a wedding portrait, just a small stamped ID photo required for filing. Julian was smiling, faintly, leaning slightly toward Asher. Asher looked calm and distant, entirely out of place against the cheerful red backdrop. They'd never had a real wedding. His mother had been hospitalized around the same time, and Asher had married a man he didn't love with no ceremony at all. Just a signature and a fee. I'd expected pages of writing after that, the day he finally got what he wanted. There was nothing, not one word. I kept turning. No more photos of Asher after the wedding, just scattered lines. He's exhausted lately. The company's just starting and he's doing everything himself. Made his favorite dinner, but he came home smelling like someone else's cologne and went straight to bed. He bought an apartment near the office, and that man is always there. I'll never mean as much to him as Marcus does. I know that. I still want a child with him anyway. Am I past saving? Went to the nursing home today. Ran into Dex, helping his own father check out. He told me I was an idiot. That Asher would never fall for a trick like this. I left because I knew he was right. I was ready to let go. Then he came home drunk that night, and I couldn't stop myself from kissing him, and for the first time, he kissed back. A blank space. Then, on the next page, I think he might be pregnant. Well, the surrogate is... Those 2 months really had been the best stretch of their entire marriage. Even though the original Julian knew perfectly well Asher's warmth was only ever about the baby. By then, he didn't care what the reason was. He'd loved this man since the day he collapsed in a training yard. And he was still hopelessly in love with him now, still trying to draw warmth out of someone who'd never really offered it freely. The last page held a torn termination form for the surrogacy contract, Asher's signature scrawled in the corner. It hit me like a live wire, image after image crashing over me at once. And then, all at once, I understood something that should have been obvious from the start. I never transmigrated. I am Julian. I sat with that sentence for a long time, turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what's living underneath it. It explained too much to be wrong. It explained why I'd known the layout of this house before anyone showed me around it. Why certain smells, clay dust, a particular cheap cologne. The inside of a specific coffee shop 3 blocks from campus hit me with a grief that had no business being mine. It explained why. Somewhere under all the calculating and the champagne and the smug little victory lap, some small stubborn part of me had never once managed to feel good about any of it. The car accident hadn't dropped a stranger into this body. It had cracked something open in the man who already lived here. And what climbed out afterward was every ugly thing Asher had ever accused him of, worn like armor because it hurt less than the alternative. Believing I didn't love him anymore was easier than sitting with 5 years of loving someone who'd only ever loved me back by accident. For 2 months, for the wrong reasons. I put the album back in its box, closed the lid, and didn't cry. Because crying felt like it belonged to somebody I wasn't ready to be yet. I was still sitting there, staring at nothing, when the doorbell rang. My phone rang, jarring in the silence of the study. Dex, did you go see Asher today? Yeah. How'd you know? A brief hesitation. He called me, asking questions about you. I see. I didn't press. Dex, catching the flatness in my voice. Softened. It's late. You still up? The doorbell rang before I could answer. I hung up, went downstairs, and opened the door without inviting the visitor in. It was dark out, streetlights catching Asher's face half in shadow. What do you want? His lips were pale. I came to apologize. 3 hours late. If he'd left the hospital when I did. No need, I said flatly. It's in the past. Julian, please. Let me explain. That day I was just impulsive. Impulsive, I said softly. Or planned. His face went blank. Carrying our child must have been unbearable for you. Was that it? He froze, eyes shutting for a long moment. At first, I really didn't want it. But as time went on, his voice cracked. I was confused. I regret it. Is it too late to regret it now? His shoulders were shaking, but no words came. I gave him a faint smile. You wanted me to believe I'd caused it myself, that my temper had lost the baby, so I'd carry the guilt forever and never bring it up again. That's how you get to walk away clean. That's how it works. Isn't it? He stared at me, stunned that I'd worked it out at all. Deep down, he'd always believed I was exactly the kind of possessive, jealous man who'd never let it go otherwise. Why go after Marcus that day? He asked instead, voice barely above a whisper. Why did you suddenly? I looked at him quietly. This was the man I'd apparently loved for a decade. And even now, in this exact moment, half his attention was still somewhere else. No particular reason. I said, didn't like him. He had it coming. The baby's gone. We're divorced. You can be with him now, you should be happy. No. He stepped forward, grabbing my wrist. I don't love him. I don't. Asher, can we please stop talking like this? I started to pull free when a soft laugh cut through the dark behind me. Well, Dex said, guess I picked a great time to show up. Asher froze completely. I only then registered that Dex was supposed to be out of town this weekend. He tucked a strand of hair behind his ear, eyes glinting coldly at Asher. Didn't I already tell you? You're the one who wanted the divorce. You don't get to come back and bother him. My relationship with Julian isn't your business. Asher snapped. Dex raised an eyebrow, stepped closer, and looped his arm easily through mine. My pulse jumped. Dex. He tilted his head at me, smiling that easy, sultry but somehow innocent way he had. What? Thinking about going back to him. No such plans. Why are you back so suddenly? If I hadn't come back, he said, would I be watching him harass you on your own doorstep instead? Asher's eyes stayed locked on where Dex's arm hooked through mine, going red at the edges. Don't act so noble. Dex, you know exactly what you want out of this. Dex laughed, unbothered. Since you seem to know so much, go ahead. Say it out loud. Asher's mouth stayed shut. Dex smirked. Fine. I'll say it for you. I've been waiting for the two of you to divorce so I could finally go after him myself. Chances like this don't come around twice. So, of course, I'm taking it. The words landed harder than I expected, ringing in my ears longer than they should have. And if you had even a little decency, Dex went on, you wouldn't have shown up here tonight asking him to explain himself. Do you really think there's someone out there who forgives you forever? No matter what. Asher's face went bloodless. I didn't mean to. He's finally moving on. Dex cut him off. Cold. Why would you come back and try to drag him under again? Something about that phrasing snagged in my head, finally moving on, but Dex didn't seem to notice my reaction. You should go, he told Asher. Don't come back. Asher looked close to collapsing, gaze gone, unfocused. I didn't want to watch any more of it. All right, I said. You asked your questions. I answered them. As of tonight, we have no connection left at all. I turned to go inside. A dull thud sounded behind me. Asher had dropped to his knees on the wet pavement. Julianne. His voice shook. Rao. I know it was my fault. All of it. Please, one more chance. Let's start over. Dex's eyes flicked to me, all the usual sharpness draining out of his face, replaced by something quiet and nervous. His hand tightened at his side. I was waiting for my answer too. I looked down at Asher for a long moment. 5 years of marriage. I said finally. And I was never Marcus. I was never who you wanted. All I ever did was make your life harder. And I was foolish enough to believe I could keep you anyway. That's what you think of me, isn't it? I went pale. You think this whole marriage was forced on you. That if it weren't for your mother, you'd never have looked at me twice. And none of this, the fights, the years, any of it would have happened. That's how you see it. That's what you told me before the accident, isn't it? I only said that out of anger. I didn't mean. That conversation, the one I now remembered with someone else's memory, had been the moment the original Julian finally understood exactly how laughable he looked in Asher's eyes. After the surrogacy ended, heartbroken and convinced he'd caused it himself, he'd started wondering if letting Asher go was the right thing to do. When Marcus asked to meet, Julian went, hoping to finally clear the air with the man who'd shadowed his entire marriage. He never got the chance to ask a single question, because Marcus handed him the termination paperwork instead. Julianne, did you really think a baby would make him love you? I was there when you called him during that business trip. I even told him he should listen to you and stay home. Do you know what he actually said? That you were trying to trap him. And it was exhausting. You've loved him since freshman year, haven't you? Because he fainted once and you carried him to the infirmary. That's sweet. Sure. But expecting a lifetime out of it. Stop fooling yourself. He's sick of you. The idea of having your child disgusts him. Julian never expected Marcus to throw himself down those stairs deliberately. And he certainly never expected Asher to walk in at that exact second. Asher hadn't asked a single question that day, just knelt beside Marcus, crying, not sparing his own husband a glance. Later, when Julian finally cornered him to talk about the baby, Asher's only response was, how long are you going to keep doing this? Do you know how much you disgust me? Julian had walked the streets aimlessly for hours after that, those words looping on repeat. Am I really that selfish? That extreme? That disgusting? And then a car had found him mid-thought and everything had gone dark. When I woke up, I'd become a different version of myself. A version built entirely out of Asher's worst assumptions. Mad, obsessive, selfish, and most conveniently, for the story I told myself, no longer in love with him. I looked Asher dead in the eyes and said it out loud. In this version, I don't love you anymore. It was my own love that put you on a pedestal you never asked to stand on. You were never obligated to be worth it. Rain had started somewhere in the middle of all that, thin and cold, soaking into his shoulders while he stayed exactly where he'd knelt. I didn't argue. I didn't reach for me again. He just stayed there, folding in on himself a little more with every word, until there was nothing left to say to a man who'd already decided not to listen. I turned and walked back inside. And this time, I didn't look back to see whether he'd finally gotten up. I woke the next morning to the smell of something cooking and wandered into the kitchen, stunned to find Dex actually at the stove. What's the occasion? Chen. You cook now. He tilted his head toward the garden. It's a day someone annoying finally left. Asher had knelt outside for the rest of the night, and I hadn't bothered going back out to check on him. I'd pulled Dex, still arguing, back inside and gone to sleep in separate rooms. For the record, I sat down and took a bite of the toast, slightly burnt, Also happens to be the first time you've ever failed at cooking. Dex reached for the plate. Is it that bad? Let me remake it. I held it out of reach. No need. It's not going to waste. He eyed me, skeptical. Want a bite? Just as he leaned in to take one. I kissed the corner of his mouth instead. He froze. His ears went bright red. Julian. I smiled, satisfied, and pinched his cheek. I heard everything, every word, out there in the rain last night. I was quiet for a long moment before folding himself into my arms. I thought maybe you'd actually changed it into someone else. After the accident, you didn't even feel like the same person for weeks. I genuinely thought I'd be stuck looking after a stranger for the rest of my life. How could I ever turn into a stranger to you? I said, ruffling his hair, even on the days I didn't fully trust myself. He looked up at me, smug. Good. Took you long enough to use your brain. Years of pining. Finally paying off. Something tightened in my chest that felt suspiciously like the original Julian's memories catching up to mine. How does someone as sharp as you fall for someone as stupid as me? He puffed up. Because I have excellent taste? I knew I was waiting for someone worth it. I laughed. Yeah, you're the best. We got married quietly the following spring, no big ceremony. Just the two of us and a stack of paperwork that, this time, actually meant something. Lately, there's a boy who keeps turning up everywhere. Lecture halls, the badminton courts, even my shift at the pottery shop. His attempts at being subtle are terrible, everything he feels shows up on his face immediately. And it's more than a little annoying. I've had people interested in me before. None of them were this obvious. I figured he'd give up eventually. I didn't. I started spending more time with Marcus, hoping Julian would take the hint. He did seem to notice. I didn't see him for a long stretch after that. I told myself I felt relieved. Told myself, rich kids give up fast. He's never known real hardship. He's nothing like Marcus and me. I remembered something Marcus once said, and my mood soured for reasons I didn't examine. Even his gentle hints that we should finally be together started to irritate me, and I found excuses to put him off no time. I said I had to take care of my parents. Then my mother's condition got worse, and I needed money I didn't have. That's when Julian appeared again, offering everything and asking, on the surface, for nothing. What do you want in exchange? I asked. He shook his head. I laughed, bitterly, not sure if I was mocking him or myself. Fine. Let's be together. Then, I knew exactly what he wanted. Even if he pretended otherwise, I needed the money. I sold myself to him. Plainly. And I've never pretended it was anything more romantic than that. His family life was a mess, so he clung to me constantly. And I never had the time to give back. Eventually, he pulled away. I thought he'd finally let it go until I found out he'd been quietly making Marcus's life miserable behind my back the whole time. He denied it every time I confronted him. We fought endlessly. When he finally stopped, I felt relief until I saw him at the nursing home, talking to Dex, his childhood friend, someone from the same world he came from. The kind of match everyone always assumed made more sense than me. I could see how Dex looked at him. He complained to Dex, bickered with him, laughed with him, all the things he never once did with me. He tells me he loves me, and he's over there with someone else. I thought I was drunk that night I kissed him. I wasn't. I don't know where the possessiveness came from. I'd never let myself feel it before, but it consumed me before I understood what was happening. When the surrogate confirmed the pregnancy, I felt something close to relief. Now we'll have to stay together. I don't fully know. Even now, what made me decide to end it instead? I told myself I was punishing him. I was wrong. It hurt me 1,000 times worse than I ever expected it to. Everything after that spiraled. I don't remember exactly what I said to him. I must have lost my mind a little. When he signed the divorce papers without a single argument, that's when it finally landed. I'd actually lost him. I couldn't let him go. By the time I understood that, it was already too late. I fired Marcus not long after and leaked a story about kickbacks and stolen trade secrets that wasn't entirely true. He couldn't find work anywhere in the city after that, begged outside my office for days, and eventually left town for good. I couldn't bring myself to delete Julian's number from my phone. One night, drunk, I called it anyway. Disconnected. Later, I heard he and Dex had gotten married in some small courthouse ceremony neither of them bothered to post about. That's when I finally understood, completely, that I'd lost him for good, not to circumstance, but to my own choices, one after another. It was my fault. All of it. I'm sorry. Please don't let me see you again. I saw Asher again 3 years after that night. My mother isn't doing well. She'd like to see you. His message said, and I barely recognized the man who'd sent it. The Asher I remembered had been sharp, glamorous, untouchable. The man waiting for me now looked gaunt, aged well beyond 3 years worth of time. I heard later he'd gone through half a dozen old classmates just trying to track down my new number. Everything between us was long finished, but I couldn't stop thinking about his mother, frail and alone in a hospital bed somewhere. I agreed. I've got somewhere to be later, so I can't stay long. His dull eyes lit up, clearly not expecting me to say yes so easily. That's thank you. I already called ahead. We drove out together. His mother wasn't at the nursing home anymore a few years back. I learned. Marcus had joined one of Asher's rival firms out of spite and systematically dismantled his company from the inside. Asher's business collapsed. He'd sunk into debt, borrowed heavily from old classmates, and eventually couldn't cover the nursing home fees anymore. His mother now lived in a rundown rental apartment on the far side of the city. At the door, Asher hesitated a long moment before pushing it open. His mother lay in bed, thin as paper. "Mom," he said softly. She heard him, then slowly turned her face away and closed her eyes. "Mom, Julian came to see you." She froze, then lifted her head with visible effort. "Mrs. Sue," I said gently. Tears welled instantly, falling onto hands gone, brittle and bony. Asher moved to wipe them away. She pushed his hand off. "Get out. I don't have a son like you." Asher stumbled backward and hit the floor, eyes brimming. I felt genuinely out of my depth, unsure what had broken between them so completely. "Mrs. Sue, please don't upset yourself." She only cried harder, voice cracked and hoarse. "I know everything now. Julian, it was Asher who wronged you. Our whole family wronged you." I was quiet for a moment before shaking my head. "It's in the past. Everyone's built a different life since then. We should all just move forward, don't you think?" She turned her face away, still crying. "You're a good man. Julian, you shouldn't come here again." Asher, eyes red and swollen, offered to walk me down. "No need," I said, checking my phone. "Take care of your mother." He gave a bitter, hollow smile. "Ever since she found out about the divorce, she won't look at me, just gets angrier every time she sees my face." I wasn't in the mood to hear it, and honestly, I wasn't interested either. I grabbed my keys. "Julian, are you in a hurry? We could get lunch. Or tea." "Can't. Gotta pick up Mia from school." Asher froze, like he'd been struck by lightning. Face draining of color. What?" "Oh, forgot to mention. Mia, our daughter." I smiled. Dex and I had adopted her 2 years back. A bright, stubborn little thing with Dex's exact sense of humor and absolutely none of his patience. "You haven't met her. She's got her dad's eyes and my terrible attitude. Gorgeous kid." Asher didn't say another word. He sank onto the couch, covered his face, and started crying quietly. I turned and left. As the door shut behind me, I heard it break open into full, unguarded sobbing. I didn't look back. I walked straight to my car and drove to the school. Daddy, a small, warm bundle of energy, launched herself into my arms the second I stepped through the gate. I swung her up onto my hip. "Come on. Papa Dex is cooking something special tonight." She wrinkled her nose at me, all mock despair. "Daddy, I want your cooking." I tapped her nose. "Deal." In the car, Mia fell asleep against her booster seat within 10 minutes. One small hand still curled around a crayon drawing she'd made that afternoon, 3 stick figures under a lopsided sun, labeled in wobbly kindergarten handwriting. "Daddy, Papa, Mo." I glanced at it in the rearview mirror at a red light and felt something settle in my chest that had never quite managed to sit still before. Not once in 5 years of somebody else's marriage. Not even in the giddy, reckless weeks right after the divorce when I thought money alone was going to be enough. It wasn't the money. In the end, it never really had been. It was a burnt piece of toast. A man who cooked badly on purpose just to make me laugh. A kid who wanted my cooking over anyone else's for no good reason at all. Whatever had been missing in this life had long since been filled back in. And filled well. The past is exactly that past. Smoke on the wind. Gone the second you stop looking for it. We hope this one stayed with you a little. If it did, don't scroll past without leaving a comment. Tell us the moment that hit hardest. We genuinely read everyone. A like and a subscribe helps this story reach someone else who needs it too. And it's what keeps us coming back to tell you the next one. Thank you for being here till the very end.